The night I drove my coworker's mother home after dinner, I thought I was doing one small decent thing. Then she looked at me in the passenger seat, with rain sliding down the window behind her, and asked, "Are you always this gentle?" My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 36. I work as a project manager at a mid-sized architecture firm in Portland, and I've spent most of my adult life being the guy people call reliable, which is a nice way of saying they call me last after the interesting men have said no. I don't say that with bitterness. It's just an observation I made a long time ago, somewhere around the end of my last relationship, when a woman I loved for 4 years told me that being with me was like living inside a well-organized filing cabinet. Safe, predictable, nothing you'd ever fight for. I didn't fight for her either in the end. I think some part of me had already agreed with her. That night started ordinary enough. Marcus, one of the associates I work with, invited a few of us to his mother's 60th birthday dinner at a private room in a restaurant downtown, the kind with low lighting and candles that make everyone look 10 years younger and slightly guilty. I almost said no. I don't love forced social gatherings where I know maybe two people in the room. But Marcus had covered for me on a deadline in March, and I believe in paying debts. So I put on a decent jacket and showed up with a bottle of wine I hoped wasn't too cheap or too try hard. The restaurant smelled like garlic and candle wax and rain that people had tracked in on their shoes. Outside the windows, downtown Portland was doing its November thing, gray and wet and glowing faintly with brake lights. Inside, there were maybe 14 people crowded around a long table, wine glasses catching the candlelight, a birthday cake box sitting unopened on a side table, like a promise nobody had gotten around to keeping yet. That's when I first saw her. Marcus's mother, seated near the head of the table in a navy dress that looked like it had been chosen with care. Her hair pinned up in a way that softened her face without hiding the tiredness underneath it. She had the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself, the kind you notice slowly, the way you notice a good building only after you've walked past it a few times and finally looked up. Her name, I would learn within the hour, was Elena. She smiled at everyone who came to sit near her. She thanked the waiter twice for water nobody had asked for, and within 10 minutes of sitting down, I watched Marcus interrupt her mid-sentence to tell a story about his fantasy football league, and I watched her fold her hands very carefully in her lap and let the sentence die there, unfinished, like she'd expected it to die and had simply been waiting for the moment. Nobody else seemed to notice. That's the thing about small cruelties. They're quiet enough that a room full of people can miss them or choose to. A phone buzzed somewhere down the table, and one of Jess's friends laughed too loudly at whatever appeared on the screen, the sound cutting across the table like something breaking a held note. Elena's coat had slid halfway off the back of her chair, and she reached back once to straighten it herself, since no one else had thought to. I watched her do it without complaint, the way you watch someone perform a task they've performed 10,000 times without anyone ever once offering to help. The waiter refilled water glasses around the table and skipped hers twice, and she simply reached for the pitcher herself both times, quiet, unbothered on the surface, though I noticed the second time her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before she smoothed it away again. I noticed because noticing is sort of my whole personality. It's what makes me good at my job, actually. I catch the load-bearing wall nobody flagged in the blueprint. The clause in the client contract that will bite us in 8 months. The version of a person that they're not performing loudly enough for anyone else to see. I caught Elena's hand, going still, around the stem of her wine glass, when Marcus's girlfriend made a joke about how their family reunions must be so cute, with mom still trying to keep up with everyone's slang. I caught the tightening at the corner of Elena's mouth. The kind of smile you build like scaffolding just to hold the face up through an evening. I thought, not for the first time that year, about the woman who'd called me a filing cabinet, about how she'd said it almost gently, like she was doing me a favor by naming the thing before it could surprise me later in some crueler way. I had spent 3 years turning that sentence over, wondering whether the problem was that I was boring, or whether the problem was that I had simply never been looked at by someone who knew what to do with steadiness instead of taking it for granted. Watching Elena fold and refold that quiet dignity around herself all evening, I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet, something that felt suspiciously like recognition. I was seated 2 chairs down from her, close enough to lean over when the table's attention scattered into 3 side conversations. "You cooked something for tonight too, didn't you?" I said. Not really a question. There was a foil-covered dish sitting near the kitchen pass, and I'd seen the way she kept glancing at it, waiting for someone to serve it, to mention it, to notice. She looked at me like I'd caught her doing something private. "How did you know that?" "You keep looking at it like it's a kid at its own recital that nobody's watching." That got a real laugh out of her, quiet and surprised, like it had escaped before she could decide whether to let it. "It's a tres leches cake, my mother's recipe. Marcus said he'd mention it before dessert." She glanced toward her son, who was now standing to refill his own glass, laughing loudly at something across the table. "I don't think he will." "I'll mention it," I said. "I'm shameless about cake." She studied me for a second too long, like she was recalibrating something. "You're Daniel. Marcus talks about you. He says you're the only person at that office who actually finishes what he starts. That's generous. Mostly, I just don't like leaving things half-built." "That's not a small thing," she said, and there was something underneath the sentence, some private weight she wasn't handing to me directly, but I felt the edge of it anyway. I asked her what she did, not what her son did, not what kind of mother she'd been, just her. And she blinked like the question had arrived from an unfamiliar direction. "I run a small flower shop off Hawthorne," she said. 22 years now. I almost went to art school back when I was young and had opinions about my own life. Then I got married, had Marcus, and somewhere along the way, flowers became the version of art I let myself keep. "That's not settling," I said. "That's still a garden you built." She looked at me for a long moment, like I'd said something she hadn't expected a man in a rented dinner jacket to understand. "Most people don't put it that way." "Most people aren't listening," I said. And I meant it as something small and true, not a line, though I could see in her face that she wasn't used to receiving true things without suspecting them of being lines. Before I continue, if you enjoyed this story, I share lots of steamy, uncensored stories on my Patreon page, which is linked in the description. Details are in the description and comments. Be careful, it's very, very hot inside dinner, went on. I did mention the cake, loudly enough that the table quieted, and someone finally cut into it, and Elena's eyes found mine across the candlelight. with something like gratitude that made my chest feel strange and full. Marcus's girlfriend made one more comment, something about Elena needing helpers her age to carry things. And I watched Elena's spine straighten, watched her decide, visibly, not to answer it, watched 22 years of practice go into the smile she gave instead. By the time the dinner wound down, rain had started outside in earnest, streaking the tall windows in long silver lines. Marcus, 3 drinks deep and loud about it, patted his mother's shoulder and said, "Mom, you good getting a ride? I told Jess I'd drop her and her sister first. It's kind of out of the way to swing by yours after. I can call a car," Elena said, already reaching for her purse, already performing the version of herself that doesn't inconvenience anyone. "I'm headed that direction," I said. It wasn't strictly true. It became true the moment I said it. "I can take you," Marcus grinned, already half turned toward the door. "Careful, she'll adopt to you. Don't let her talk your ear off about the shop, man. She'll go for an hour." "I'd probably listen for 2, I said, keeping my voice easy, not making a thing of it. But I saw Elena's face flicker, saw her hear the sentence for what it was. A small correction offered, without ever raising a hand against her son. The car ride was where everything changed, though neither of us would have called it that in the moment. I held the restaurant door for her, walked her under my umbrella to my car in a parking structure that smelled like wet concrete, and once we were both inside, doors shut, rain drumming on the roof, but the noise of the dinner fell away like it had happened to different people. I turned the heater up. The radio was on low, something instrumental and unremarkable, and I didn't reach to change it because it felt like the right kind of silence to leave alone. "Thank you for tonight," Elena said after a few blocks, her hands folded in her lap, exactly the way they'd been at the table. "For the cake, for the ride, for not laughing along. You don't have to thank me for basic decency," I said. She turned toward me then, the streetlight sliding gold and orange across her face through the window, rain streaking the glass beside her like something crying quietly on her behalf. "Are you always this gentle?" It wasn't a flirtation, or not only that. It landed somewhere heavier than that, like a question she'd been carrying for longer than the length of one dinner. Maybe for years, maybe since a marriage that had taught her gentleness was rare enough to require confirmation whenever she found it. I laughed, a little awkward, buying myself a second. I used to think so. Then someone told me being gentle was the same thing as being boring. I spent a while trying to be something harder instead. Did it work? No. I hated who I was when I tried. Turns out, I don't know how to be anything else, even when it cost me something. She turned to look out the window for a moment, watching storefronts slide by, dark and rain-blurred, neon signs bleeding color across the wet glass. "I used to think I was good at reading people," she said quietly. 20-some years of running a shop, you learn to read what people actually want when they say they're just browsing. But I stopped being able to read my own family a long time ago. I don't know when that happened. I think it happened slowly enough that I never noticed the exact day. "I don't think anyone notices the exact day," I said. "It's not a door slamming. It's more like a hallway getting a little longer every year until one day you realize you can't see the room you started in anymore." She looked back at me then, something shifting behind her eyes, some old guardedness loosening by a degree. "That's exactly it. That's exactly what it feels like." The wipers kept time against the glass, steady and unhurried, and for a moment Neither of us said anything at all, content to let the quiet do some of the talking instead. She was quiet for a moment, watching the wipers cut back and forth across the windshield. "My husband died 6 years ago," she said. "Before that, we'd been quietly unhappy for at least 10. Not cruel to each other, just careful, distant. I spent so many years being useful, being Marcus's mother, being the woman who remembers everyone's allergies and keeps the shop open on Sundays, that I forgot what it felt like to be looked at like a whole person instead of a role somebody needed filled. "You're not a role tonight," I said. "You haven't been all evening, as far as I'm concerned." She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I had to bring my eyes back to the road. That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman my age who isn't used to hearing it. I don't say things I don't mean. It's possibly my only interesting quality. That got a real laugh out of her again, low and surprised, and something in the car loosened after that. Some tension neither of us had named releasing itself into the rain and the heater noise and the quiet, competent hum of the engine. When we pulled up outside her house, a small craftsman with a porch light glowing yellow through the downpour, she didn't move to get out right away. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. And then, before I could answer, added, "I'm not asking because I'm lonely or because I can't get myself inside my own house safely. I'm asking because I would like one conversation tonight that doesn't make me feel invisible, and I think you might be capable of giving me that." I sat with that for a second, feeling the weight of what she was actually asking and what she wasn't. "I don't want to cross a line," I said honestly. "You're Marcus's mother. I work with him 5 days a week, I'm aware of exactly who I am to everyone at that table tonight," she said, an edge of something sharp under the words, not aimed at me. "For 1 hour, I'd like to just be Elena. Coffee, conversation, nothing you need to feel guilty about in the morning." I followed her inside. Her house smelled like dried lavender and old books, warm in a way that felt lived in rather than staged. She made coffee in a kitchen with yellow walls and photographs on the fridge, most of them Marcus at various ages, a few of a marriage that looked, in the photos at least, happier than she described it. She took her earrings out and set them on the counter without ceremony, and pulled the pins from her hair one by one, and it fell loose around her shoulders, and something about the unguarded plainness of the gesture hit me harder than anything practiced ever could have. We talked until nearly 1 in the morning. She told me about the flower shop, about a woman with silvering hair, about the argument she'd had with her sister over their mother's ring, about how she sometimes thought about selling the shop and traveling somewhere she'd never let herself imagine as a young wife. She told me about the year Marcus turned 13 and stopped hugging her in public, and how she'd told herself that was just what boys did, until she realized somewhere around his 20s that he'd simply absorbed, without ever meaning to, the quiet lesson that mothers were meant to be background furniture in a life that had moved on past them. I told her about my last relationship, about the filing cabinet comment, about how I'd spent 3 years afterward wondering if being decent was actually a form of cowardice, a way of never risking enough to be truly seen. I told her about my father, a quiet man himself, who used to say that the measure of a man wasn't how loud he could get, but how steady he stayed when nobody was clapping for it. I hadn't believed him for a long time. Sitting in Elena's kitchen at midnight, I found myself believing it again for the first time in years. She laughed at something I said about my terrible attempt at cooking in my 20s. A real laugh this time, unguarded, her head tipping back slightly, and I thought that I would drive through worse rain than this, just to hear that sound again. "I don't think it's cowardice," she said. "I think it's rare. And rare things get mistaken for weakness by people who've never had to work to keep them." At some point, sitting close on her small couch with the rain still going outside, the space between us collapsed by inches until her face was close enough that I could smell her perfume, something warm and floral that had probably been on since the restaurant. I leaned in, and so did she. And for one long second, we were a breath apart, and I stopped. "I don't want tonight to be a mistake you regret at your son's dinner table next month," I said quietly. She studied me, something like respect moving across her face. "I appreciate that you stopped. I do. But don't ever decide for me what I'll regret. I've had enough men and enough years deciding what's good for me without asking. If I kiss you tonight, it's because I want to, not because you allowed it." I didn't have an answer for that except the truth, which was that she was right, and that I'd correct the instinct going forward, and that I still didn't kiss her that night. Not because I doubted her, but because some part of both of us understood that this needed room to become real in daylight too, not only in the forgiving dark of one rain-soaked night. I drove home a little after 1, and I did not sleep much. Over the following weeks, we found each other in small increments. I texted the next morning just to ask if she'd gotten some rest, and she wrote back an hour later a message that read, "Thank you for asking. That was formal of me. Sorry." Followed 30 seconds later by, "I'm out of practice at this. Be patient with me." I told her patience was one of the few things I had in surplus. We ran into each other, engineered mostly by her, at the flower shop, where I went to buy something for my sister's birthday, and stayed 40 minutes longer than the errand required. We ran into each other at a company mixer Marcus's firm co-hosted with mine, where she'd been invited as a guest and found an excuse to ask me to help carry a box of decorations to her car, though the box weighed almost nothing and we both knew it. Small things built between us, the way real things always do, slowly, in increments too small to name individually. Her hand brushed mine, reaching for the same coffee cup at that mixer, and neither of us pulled away right away. I noticed her laugh loosening around me, less careful, less built. She reached over once and fixed my collar before a work event, her fingers steady and warm against my throat for half a second longer than the task required, and neither of us mentioned it. One Saturday, she called and asked if I would help her move a heavy shelf in the shop's back room, though I discovered when I arrived that the shelf weighed almost nothing and had already been moved twice by her part-time employee that same morning. We ended up sitting on overturned crates in the cool back room, surrounded by buckets of unopened roses, drinking coffee from paper cups, talking for 2 hours about nothing important and everything that mattered. And when I finally left, she stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, watching me go, and I caught myself doing the same in the rearview mirror. Another evening, at a company mixer neither of us had expected the other to attend, I watched her navigate a room full of people who didn't know what to make of a graceful woman standing near the food table alone, and I crossed the room without deciding to, just to stand beside her, just so she wouldn't have to be alone in a crowd again, the way she'd been alone at that first dinner. She thanked me for it later with a look instead of words, the kind of look that said more than a sentence could have. "Being wanted at my age feels dangerous," she told me one evening, sitting on her porch, while the last of the light went orange and then gray. People either pity you for it, like desire has an expiration date, or they fetishize you for it, like being an older woman is a category instead of a person. I don't know which is worse. I don't see a category, I said. I see a whole woman who runs a flower shop and argues with her sister about a ring and makes tres leches cake nobody else appreciates enough. I see you. That's not a fetish. That's just paying attention. She reached for my hand on the porch step and held it, and we stayed there a long time without needing to say anything else. It was 6 weeks in when Marcus found out, and it went about as badly as I'd privately feared it might. He'd come by his mother's house, unannounced on a Sunday, the way sons sometimes do, and found my jacket over the back of a kitchen chair, and me standing in the kitchen in shirt sleeves, helping her fix a leak under the sink, because she'd mentioned it, and I don't like leaving things unfinished. It looked domestic because it was domestic, and Marcus's face went through several colors before he found words. "Are you kidding me right now?" he said, staring at me like I'd broken into the house instead of been invited. "Mom, what is this?" "This is Daniel helping me with my sink," Elena said, standing straighter than I'd ever seen her stand. "And also, since you're asking with that tone, this is a man I've been seeing for 6 weeks. Seeing, Marcus repeated, like the word tasted bad. "He's my coworker. He's younger than you. Mom, this is embarrassing." "Embarrassing for who?" Elena said, and her voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through the kitchen. "For you, because your friends might ask about it? Because you'd have to explain that your mother is still a person with wants after your father died? I am your mother, Marcus, but I am not furniture in your life. I raised you. I did not die afterward. He's just being nice to you," Marcus said, turning to me now, some mixture of anger and something raw underneath it. Maybe guilt he didn't know what to do with yet. "That's what he does. He's nice to everyone. It's not. You're not special to him. You're just an easy person to be nice to." That one landed somewhere I hadn't braced for. I kept my voice level anyway, because losing my temper would have proven every quiet thing this family had assumed about men who are kind for a living are. "I understand this is a lot to walk into on a Sunday," I said, "but I'm not going to let you talk about your mother, or about what's between us, like it's something small. My feelings for her are real. They're not a favor I'm doing anyone, and they're not something I'm going to apologize for existing. You don't get to decide when I'm allowed to be wanted," Elena said to her son, quieter now, but somehow heavier for it. "You don't get to decide that the only acceptable version of me is the one who drives you places and holds your birthday cake and disappears the rest of the time. I have been disappearing for 30 years, Marcus. I'm done." "You don't understand what it's like," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly, some younger version of himself showing through the anger. "Everyone at that dinner is going to ask me about this. Jess's mom is going to ask me about this. It's humiliating. Humiliating for you to explain that your mother is a person," Elena said. "Or humiliating because you've spent 30 years assuming I'd never need explaining, because I'd just always be there, doing the explaining for everyone else." Marcus didn't answer that. He looked, for one unguarded second, like a much younger boy standing in a kitchen that no longer made sense to him, and then the anger came back up over his face like a shutter closing. Marcus left without finishing his sentence, the kitchen door swinging shut behind him hard enough to rattle the window over the sink. the one I still hadn't finished fixing. Elena sat down heavily at her kitchen table, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked less like a woman holding herself together and more like someone finally letting a weight down that she'd carried too long to notice its shape anymore. "I need to ask you something," she said, not looking at me right away. "And I need you to actually think about it instead of just being kind to me, because I've had enough kindness in the last hour to distrust it for a while. Ask, are you sure this isn't some mixture of pity and protectiveness dressed up as attraction? I don't want to be someone's rescue mission. I don't want to be a rebellion against your last relationship or a fantasy about being wanted by someone younger. I need this to be real, or I need it to end now, cleanly, before it costs me my son." I sat down across from her and took a moment before I answered, because she deserved the moment, not a reflex. "I like who I am around you," I said. "That's the truth under everything else. I don't feel used for being gentle with you. I don't feel like the reliable guy nobody really wants. I feel seen, actually seen, for the first time in longer than I want to admit. That's not pity. Pity doesn't keep a man up until 1 in the morning thinking about a woman's laugh." She studied me for a long moment, her eyes bright and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from her before. Not even on the porch, not even that first rainy night. "Are you always this gentle?" she asked again, softer this time. The question worn smooth by repetition, meaning something different now than it had the first time. "No," I said, "but I want to be with you." I used to think gentle meant easy to leave, something people packed up and walked away from because it never put up a fight. Then you looked at me like it meant something worth staying for. I don't want to go back to being the kind of man who confuses that difference. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. And this time, when I leaned in, there was no hesitation waiting on either side of the distance between us. The kiss was slow, careful, her hand coming up to rest against my jaw, like she was making sure I was real. My own hand finding the small of her back, like something in me had been waiting weeks for permission it had finally been given. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't the kind of kiss two people give each other when they're trying to prove something. It was the kind that happens when two tired, careful people finally stop being careful for one breath and find out the world doesn't end. We stayed together at that kitchen table a long time after, her head against my shoulder, the leak under the sink still dripping softly, both of us too content to care. Marcus didn't call for 2 weeks. When he finally did, it was a text, short and unpolished. "Can we get coffee?" I told him yes. He didn't apologize cleanly, because people rarely do. Not in real life. Not when the guilt runs as deep as 30 years of a mother quietly disappearing into everyone else's convenience. What he did instead was harder in its way. He told me he'd been thinking about every birthday dinner where he'd let his friends make jokes about his mother's age. Every time he'd assumed she'd just adjust, just accommodate, just be fine, because she always had been before. He said watching her stand up to him in that kitchen had scared him, not because it was wrong, but because it meant he hadn't actually known his mother in years. Not really. Not as a whole person with her own hunger for things. "I'm not going to pretend I'm thrilled about this," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "It's still weird. You're my coworker. But she looked happier at Sunday dinner last week than I think I've seen her look since Dad died. And I have to actually sit with what that means about the last 6 years. I'm not trying to replace anything," I said. "And I'm not going anywhere quietly if things get difficult again. I need you to know that. "Yeah," he said, and something in his shoulders loosened, some old tension between us both, finally finding a floor to rest on. Just be good to her. Actually good. Not filing cabinet good. I didn't ask how he knew about the filing cabinet comment. I assumed his mother had told him, and I found I didn't mind that she had. Things at the office settled into an awkward but workable rhythm after that. The kind two grown men manage when they've decided the relationship matters more than the discomfort. Marcus started slowly, clumsily, calling his mother more, showing up to the shop sometimes just to help carry inventory, asking her actual questions instead of narrating his own life at her. Elena reclaimed pieces of herself that had nothing to do with me, which was, I came to understand, the most important part of everything that happened. She took a watercolor class on Tuesday evenings, something she'd wanted to do since art school and never let herself pursue. She hired a part-time employee at the shop, so she wasn't tethered to it 7 days a week. She told her sister, finally and plainly, that she was keeping their mother's ring, and the argument that followed was loud and honest, and according to Elena, strangely healing. She wasn't reclaiming her life because of me. She was reclaiming it because being seen correctly had reminded her she was allowed to want things again, and that distinction mattered to both of us. I kept fixing things around her house on weekends, not because she needed a man to do it, but because I liked working with my hands beside someone who thanked me like the work actually mattered, instead of expecting it silently. She kept teaching me small things about flowers, which ones meant gratitude and which meant apology, and which ones people bought for reasons they never said out loud. We built slowly, the kind of ordinary life neither of us had quite believed we'd get a second chance at. The kind built from Tuesday dinners and fixed sinks and watercolor classes and a shop that stayed open exactly as many days as she wanted it to, and not one day more. 6 months after that first rainy dinner, Marcus threw another one, smaller this time, just family and a few close friends, to celebrate his engagement to Jess. Elena and I arrived together. No hesitation in the doorway this time. No careful distance kept between our chairs at the table. Someone made a joke about how Elena finally had backup for family dinners now, and it landed warm instead of cruel, the kind of joke that includes, rather than diminishes, afterward, rain falling soft and steady outside. I drove her home again. The same streets, the same headlights sliding gold across wet pavement, though nothing about the car felt the same as it had that first night. She reached over in the quiet and took my hand resting on the gear shift, lacing her fingers through mine like it was the easiest, most natural gesture in the world. "Are you still always this gentle?" she asked, teasing now. The question worn soft and familiar between us, no longer a test, just a small ritual we'd built without meaning to. I brought her hand up and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, keeping my eyes on the rain-slicked road, feeling something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for years before her. "Only with you," I said. "Everyone else still gets the filing cabinet," she laughed, low and unguarded, the sound of a woman who had finally stopped bracing for the world to take something gentle away from her. And outside the window, the rain kept falling, soft and steady, over a city that had, in its quiet way, given us both exactly enough room to become who we were always supposed to be.